Hey everyone! Today on the plastic canvas we're painting a Spoiler Abomination from Zombicide Invader by Simon Games. Hey everyone, Matt here from the Plastic Canvas and welcome to episode 5 in this Zombicide Invader painting series. Today we're painting the Spoiler Abomination. This is the biggest and baddest Xeno that you'll face in this sci-fi themed version of Zombicide. Now in the previous videos in this series where I painted the workers, hunters and tanks, the purposes of those videos was for me to do a bit of an experiment to work out the most efficient way of painting each of them while still sticking to a good enough quality for them to go out on the table and still look good. Because for each of them, there were a number of other ones in the box. So I painted 5 of the workers, there were still another 30 of them in the box, and I painted 2 of the hunters and tanks because I had 2 sculpts of each, and there was still another 15 or 16 of them in the box. So I still had quite a few more to paint. So I wanted to work out what the best way to paint them was, while still keeping the time down but still keeping a good enough quality. With the Abomination here, he's the only Abomination in the box, so I don't actually need to spend time in this video working out how I'm going to paint him to keep the time down so that then when I do the rest of them, I can still keep to a good standard. So with this guy being the only one, I do spend quite a bit more time on this guy, paying more attention to the details, trying to, work those blends a little bit more with the highlighting and shading, just to try and get a better finish, a better quality to this guy, because I don't need to go back and paint any more of him. So with all of the others, I tried to keep to at most about 30 minutes for each of them. I was able to do that with the workers and the hunters. The tanks took a little bit more, but probably not too much more. With this guy, it probably takes more around the 2.5 to 3 hour mark. Because this guy is so imposing in the game, he takes 3 hit points in one attack to take down. He is that one that when he comes out, you really don't want to face off against him. So I wanted the paint job that I do on him to be imposing as well. And so yeah, I really spent some time on this guy, picked out all the little details, worked on the highlighting and shading a little bit more. So I had a bit more fun with this guy, and it was good to sort of go back to just doing a proper paint job and not just trying to, fly through it to work through them. So the overall process that I went through though to paint this guy was very similar to the other ones, because I did want, even though I finished this guy to a much higher quality than the others, I still wanted them to look like they're all part of the same alien species, like that they do actually belong together. So I'd still started with a Xeno Prime, just black, grey and then white from directly above, and that was mostly so that when I laid down that initial skin tone with my airbrush, the different gradients within the prime still came through, so I did give a bit of sort of pre-shading, I suppose, and then spent a bit of time with the blues running up the arms and legs, and I built up the gradient there quite a bit more than what I did with the other ones. So still started with that same mix of the blue and the grey, so that as it feathered out to the edge of the cone of the airbrush, it met the grey of that base skin tone, so that it feathered out alright. And then started to work those darker blues, and ended up finishing off mixing some black into that darker blue mix that I had, just for right around kind of where like the tips of his hands and right down at the bottom of his feet, just to build that gradient a little bit more, so that there is more of a depth of colour, so that from when sitting around the edge of the table, that gradient can be seen a little bit more, just stands out a bit more. And then back with that base skin tone, I just touched back up the chest and stomach and back, just some of those areas where I got a little bit more overspray from the blue than what I wanted to, and I did that with a slightly lighter skin tone than what I put down at first, and kind of tried to hit from above a little bit more, just so that it did more kind of a little bit of highlighting and left the undersides of each of the folds a little bit darker, just to kind of get some free shading going on there. And then, yeah, now just picking out some of the details. So the claws, and this has got, well, yeah, as you can see there, I'm not actually sure exactly what that's supposed to be, the bit that I'm painting at the moment, but it's kind of like a fleshy, he's got along his stomach and the lower part of his back, it looks like there's all these little mouth sort of things, and then, yeah, there's just the edge of that sort of fleshy part, so just painting all of that red. He's got eyes sticking up all over the place, so yeah, just starting to get onto that stage now. This is where I spend most of my time. Laying down that initial base coat of just doing the skin was pretty quick, because I'm using my airbrush for that. Once I got onto just the normal brushes here, this is where it starts to slow down a little bit. And I just pay a little bit more attention to the details. In the other ones in this series, so again, the workers, the hunters, and the tanks, I didn't do any real highlighting and shading just with my normal brush. I just kind of tried to use my airbrush for that, and then put the black wash over the top. With this guy, though, I did spend a little bit more time doing some shading, so I mixed up a darker version of that base skin tone that I put down, really thinned it down, and then just built up the layers in those spots where I wanted there to be shadow, so that later on down the track, when I do put that black wash over, which is again very thin down, it ties everything together, but then it makes those recesses even darker, because, you know, it already was a bit darker. Now I'm into doing the tentacles here that are coming out of his hands. Now this is a part that I really wanted to make a feature of this guy. Anytime I paint a mini, I try and have some sort of element within it that will be like a focal point first, so that when people are looking at it, their eyes are kind of drawn to something immediately. Now, early on when I started to paint this, I've painted, if you saw it, I did the Dark Young from Mansions of Madness. It's got tentacles coming out of its head. I did them in the exact same way that I did these. It's a deep purple through, and then it, you know, wet blends right through to a very light purple right on the tip. So I was picturing that for this guy as well. When I laid down that initial purple, I thought it might have looked a little bit cartoony. I wasn't sort of really sure how it was going to go, but once I got into actually building up the colors and getting that blend happening, which is just what I'm gonna start doing here, it really came together, and I was really happy with how it ended up looking. So what I'm doing here is just laying down an initial blend, and then I do a second coat, which then really builds the opacity. So I just laid down an initial coat of dark purple, just so it was just a base, you know, so it wasn't, you know, didn't have the prime sort of color with a little bit of that overspray. So I just laid down that initial purple, and now I'm just kind of blocking in the blends. So yeah, just wet blending. So just putting that base purple down again where the tentacles start, where it meets the hands, just lay down a bit of that just where I wanted the blend to be able to happen, and then I used, that was Twilight Purple, and then just with the Amethyst Purple, just painted a section of the tentacle with that, and then just blended the Amethyst Purple, which is the lighter one, into the darker purple. Whenever I wet blend, I always blend the lighter into the darker, because the darker overpowers the lighter color so much more. And then I mixed in some white into the Amethyst Purple just to finish it off. And as you can see, sitting there as well is the drying retarder, just so that I can work the blends for as long as possible. It doesn't dry too quickly. So I wasn't worried too much about building up the opacity and really getting perfect blends for this one, because I knew I was going to come back and do a second coat to really smooth it out and build the opacity up. But because the paint is on the thinner side, the lighter purple going over the darker purple that was already there, the colors weren't strong enough. So I did need those two coats. And yeah, so when I come back and do that second coat, it really finishes it off. So yeah, so it's just a case of now of really just going through, picking out the details. You can see I'm putting some washes down here over all of these mouths, so that when I come back and I do a dry brush to pick out some of the raised edges of all of those little mouths, it just helps to build that contrast a little bit. So here I'm doing the second coat for the tentacles. So I'm just doing this in the exact same way that I did with the Dark Young from Mansion. So I sort of learnt there that when doing blending like this, unless there is, of course, a different process that can be gone through, with the way that I was doing this, it really did help to do 2 coats. So yeah, so that first coat, really didn't worry about getting it perfect, because the paint was quite thin, and so the purple that was already there was coming through. But this one here really built the opacity and just finished it off well. Alright, so here I'm just starting to paint the actual eyeballs within each of these eyes that are sticking up. If you noticed before, I used the Carroburg Crimson wash on on all of the red sections, but I made sure I got in where each of these eyes are, and the reason that I did that is because in the past, when I first started painting little details like this, I might have laid down the red that was sitting in the eye socket sort of thing, and then just painted the yellow of the eyeball and finished it off there. But what I found is that if I put a wash down, it pulls really nicely around the edge of something like an eyeball, and you get this nice dark line around the edge of it. And then when then painting a color like, say, the yellow or white of an eye, it really gives a good contrast there and makes the color of the eye pop a lot more. And so with something like a yellow eye, that's a color that I really wanted to stand out. And so by putting that wash down first, it gave that nice dark line around the edge, and it just helped to build the contrast, and it just made it stand out that little bit more. So I do that if there's things like say a bracelet or a necklace or something like that, some little detail that I want to stand out. I want the color to really stand out a lot more. Put a wash over it, it'll pull nicely around it, and then it helps build that contrast. If you didn't actually want to use the wash and darken all of the area around it, you could just paint a line straight around it. That would also do the job, but I find that the wash is a nice easy way to take care of that. Now, it might be a bit hard to tell exactly what I'm doing here just because it is such a small detail, but I'm trying to paint the eyes to look as though they're glowing. Now, I have done this a few times in the past, and this way that I'm doing it here is the easiest that I found to do it. And it's basically just starting with a dark version of the color that I want the eyes to be. In this case, it's blue, so I started with a dark blue, and I put down a fairly large blue dot for that. And then I go to a lighter blue, and then put a smaller dot so that the dark blue still shows around the edge. And then finish it with just a very, very small white dot in the middle of the light blue dot so that then all three of those colors are showing. And you can do the same thing with green, red, whatever. It works with any color. I've done it with different ones. But just using those three colors, and so starting with a dark one and finishing with just a white dot, it just gives this good little gradient there, and it just helps it to look like a glowing eye. If you look at it really, really closely, the effect is lost a little bit, but for sitting in the middle of the table, works really, really well. It gives a good, simple, glowing effect without too much of a, tiresome sort of process. Now here I'm just finishing off the last stage of the highlighting for all of the red sections. Now with the claws and those red ball sort of things, I'm not actually sure what they're supposed to be, that are sticking out his front, and then there's one on the back as well. They've got quite sharp angles in them, and so what I'm just doing is some edge highlighting just to really clearly show the form and how sharp and angular they are. And so what I tried to do with those two ball things that kind of look like they're coming out his front and then the one at the back, I tried to make them look quite reflective, because in the artwork it almost looks like a gem sort of thing sticking out. I have no idea what it's supposed to be, so I just really tried to build the contrast there a lot. So I started with quite a dark red, and then used a medium, quite saturated red to do the initial highlighting, just picking out all of the edges, and then finished by, so that was the Mars red, I think it was called, the army painter one, and then I just mixed some white into that to take it to kind of a pink, but still having that red tone to it. And then just using that to just pick out the most prominent edges and the ones that are highest that would be catching the most amount of light. And it just created a good bit of gradient there, and yeah, just helped to make it look reflective. I wasn't sort of sure how to go about it, because from the artwork it was just hard to tell exactly what the material was supposed to be, but it seemed to work all right. And especially with it sitting in the middle of a table, it's a good contrast, and I think it gives a good effect. So here I'm just getting into the basing process, and I'm just following the same steps that I've done with the other ones, just so that they kind of all tie in, and I'm trying to match it to the artwork within the tiles that show the sort of outside terrain. So just trying to match the kind of Mars-ish looking terrain that's going on there. So these guys are all coming in from the outside. They haven't started within any of the facilities that are in the game. So I started with using Sterling Mud, and then I just sort of pressed into that these little rock things that I've got from Foreground, I think the brand is, and I find that just to be a really, really good way of embedding things into what would sort of look like the natural ground. So building the Sterling Mud up to be quite thick, and then while it's still wet, just pressing the rocks into that, and then as the Sterling Mud dries, it then holds them in there, and then yeah, now I'm just going through and painting everything. It takes a couple of coats to get the orange built up to what I want it to, and then the the Agrax Earth shade here just helps to darken everything, so that as I come back and highlight, it just gives a bit more depth to and brings out the unevenness of the ground. Alright, so just to finish off the actual mini while part of the base is dry, and I got out my gloss varnish, and I just picked out some of the areas that I wanted to look sort of wet or fleshy. So I've used this on the eyeballs, these red ball things that are coming through his skin, and then all of these mouths, just so that they look kind of wet and fleshy and reflective, just to sort of add a bit of extra element, and so they kind of stand out from all of the matte skin tones and that. And here I'm just picking at the raised edges of the base just to make them a little bit more orangish. So with this part here, the Abomination is done. This is the last of the Xenos. If you haven't seen the others, I have videos for the Hunters, the Workers, and the Tanks as well, so check out them if you haven't as well. And thank you very, very much for spending some time watching me paint another mini. I hope you've gotten something out of this that you can take away and use in your own painting. Please make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with these videos as they keep coming out, and make sure you stop by the Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts that I have set up for this channel, as I keep posting pictures there of things that I'm working on. So with all of that said, this is Matt from the Plastic Canvas signing out. Happy painting, everyone. Cheers.